So, Lilburn's late period, spanning the years roughly from 1965 until his retirement in 1980, is referred to in the Philip Norman biography as his electroacoustic period. For Lilburn underwent the radical self-transformation of abandoning the instrumental medium and focusing almost solely on electronic sound. But I sound like John's composition. But in fact, his manuscript paper and pen were not entirely abandoned. Rather, there was an interesting tailing off of instrumental activity during this period, and it is this I want to examine today. For in these late instrumental works, we can most clearly see Lilburn's internal and ultimately unsuccessful struggle with the very significance of composition as a communicative act. They confront head-on the strongly dialectical nature of music's semiotic realm, a dialectic situated between, to use the Persian tripartition, the co-option of the iconic and indexical power of music on the one hand, and the symbolic dimension of music as a signifier of social status on the other. So Lilburn abandoned the symphony orchestra after his third symphony, for despite the mimetic and metaphorical processes through which the orchestra can evoke the icons and indexes of a largely unpeopled rural New Zealand, it brought with it a strong symbolic whiff of Viennese coffee houses, Parisian salons, and Cologne opera theatres. So despite the broad sonic vistas of the orchestra, its semiotic baggage of European high culture became anathema to the son of a sheep farmer from the back blocks of Whanganui. The more neutral medium of tape and loudspeaker allowed Lilburn to evoke a specific geographical location and its inhabitants through the strongly iconic activity of sound recording, much more so than the mediated and compromised domain of instrumental composition. Furthermore, music notation had formed the battleground on which the intergenerational struggle between competing compositional memes had been waged by the post-war avant-garde. During the 1950s and 1960s, Lilburn found himself increasingly amidst more progressive colleagues. His star pupil, Jenny MacLeod, was firmly ensconced in the midst of the European high modernism, while his colleague Fred Page's tours of Donaueschingen and Darmstadt surely further stoked Lilburn's anxiety of anachronism. Lilburn wrote at this period, and this quote has already made its rounds in this conference, "Unless I somehow keep up with all the new developments, I might be condemned to a musical inconsequence or sterility. Of course, in human or musical terms, this would be intolerable to spend one's life keeping up with the Darmstadt Joneses." At this crucial watershed, Lilburn was aesthetically torn between the gentle modality of Vaughan Williams, Sibelius and Copeland, which had underpinned his canonic works of the 1940s, and the more confrontational demands of, say, Abulis, Stockhausen or Nono, that represented, at least in that point of time, the future direction of musical technique. So his late instrumental music is neatly symptomatic of an artistic crossroads that can, as Eve succinctly put it yesterday, be characterized as an almost paralyzing impulse. But it was not so much from facing the abyss of freedom as facing the competing pressures of the nostalgic love for Sibelius' symphonic suite and the spatially, timbrally and harmonically energized textures of, say, Stockhausen's Gesang der Jünglinge. Now, the complete list of instrumental works that Lilburn wrote in this period are thus. They're all solo works, mostly for piano, and they all feature a formal brevity of the kind championed by the Second Viennese School. The chromatic language here shows a continuing attempt to reconcile the competing pressures that were found in Lilburn's dalliance with serial technique in his Third Symphony and works such as A Birthday Offering. And it's the first of these works, the 9 short pieces, arguably the last substantial instrumental work that he wrote, that I'll examine today. These 9 short pieces show different technical approaches to the synthesis of 4 post-tonal approaches. Firstly, a kind of, and I apologize for the rather lengthy term here, but a kind of cellular post-Schoenbergian quasi-serialism. I'm not sure I could have put more qualifiers in that if I tried. Often suffused with tonal allusions, however. And actually this is seen in a number of 20th century composers such as Berg, Britten, Maxwell Davies, Della Piccola, Carter, Berio, and in New Zealand works by Jenny MacLeod and Jack Boddy, amongst others. Thematic elements are fragmented and cellular in nature, often suffused with a relatively economic intervallic language. Number 2, symmetry. And all sorts of symmetry, especially transpositionally symmetrical scale resources such as the octatonic and hexatonic collections, which of course was common in the music of Stravinsky, Messiaen and Bartók, to name a few. and also use of the strict inversional symmetry that could be found between upper and lower registers of the piano in Bartók's piano works, particularly in the last 3 books of Mikrokosmos, as well as the Bagatelles, Opus 14. Lilburn's symmetrical organisation of pitch diminishes the ability of music to create teleological trajectories of tension and release, and instead emphasises music's general air of stasis and atemporality. C. Generation of diverse local level verticalities from procedures of chromatic embellishments of simple triads, or triadic structures such as the dominant 7th chord. Something I will relate in this talk to both Lilburn's own modal practice and to pre-serial atonal works by Schoenberg and Berg. D. Deployment of temporally and registrally separated sound objects and sound strata, emphasised by the replacement of strict metrical articulation and the lyrical impulse of his earlier modal works, with a phraseology that is freed from, or is at least much more ambiguous in relation to, underlying pulse frameworks. So we see abundant use of caesuras, additive rhythms to disguise metrical articulation, pedalled resonances, unresolved chromatic ambiguities, non-teleological harmonic organisation, and wide registral delineation. So the synthesis of serial, symmetrical, and sonic spatial approaches, that was a nice sentence I had there, is evidence from the outset of the first of the 9 short pieces. It's paradigmatic of his increasing concern with gesturality, spatial and registral expansion and separation, and the sonic frisson of a chromatically saturated pitch organisation. So the piece begins with an upwardly arpeggiated hexachord, which could be thought of as simply outlining a triad of E flat minor, that's the first 3 pitches, with the additional pitch classes of a B natural, a G, and an A. This final note is rearticulated as a bell-like sonority, or perhaps more aptly a kokako-like resonance. And those of you who know his electroacoustic works study on one note will know what I'm talking about here. And that emerges from this opening pedalled wash. So let's have a listen to that. Hopefully the volume is okay. So the primary sonority of this piece is encapsulated in the first 4 pitch classes of the work, that is the E flat minor triad plus a B natural. And together these form set class 420 to use Fort's terminology. This aggregate of a minor triad plus a note a semitone away recurs throughout the piece. So here's the whole piece. Or at least the first section of the piece, with those similar constructions with the Fort names labelled on there. So these are all a major or minor triad plus a note a semitone away, and I'll reduce those down to just a series of sonorities there. So in bar 6, for example, we see a D minor chord plus a C sharp, bar 9 E flat minor with a G natural, bar 11 E minor with a C, bar 19 D minor chord with a G sharp added, and that's then followed by a C-sharp minor chord with an A added. Despite the diversity of set classes, the common generational procedure that ties them together is what I would call the triad plus 1 generative procedure. This generative procedure has precursors in earlier models and Schoenberg's pre-serial atonal works, and a good example of that is the Opus 19 number 2, that wonderfully obscure bit of music. Is it tonal? Is it not tonal? In this work, major and minor thirds are stacked and combined to form a variety of tetrachordal pitch class sets, many of which conform to this triad plus 1 constraint. All of those blue ones there. As a constraint, there are 6 possible tetrachords that can be formed. Here is the complete list, and I've highlighted 3 of them there. These are the first 3 tetrachords, or as I'll shorten it now, T plus 1, so that's triad plus a semitone, T+1 tetrachords that appear in the piece, and those are 420, 419, and 417, so sort of in reverse order. These three triads also happen to share another strong point of relationship. They're also the only three of those 6 possible tetrachords that can be explained also as subsets of the so-called hexatonic scale. That is a symmetrical mode generated from alternating minor thirds and semitones. The hexatonic scale itself, or 620 in Fort's language, turns up in its entirety in bars 7 to 8. So he has 2 T+1 chords which overlap and aggregate to form the complete symmetrical hexatonic collection. The saturation of the harmonic discourse in this work with an underlying symmetrical generative set evidences a shift away from the asymmetry of the diatonic collection and its 7 modes from earlier works. But these sonorities are not without precedent. One of the particularly idiosyncratic modal techniques that Lilburn developed in earlier works is the superposition of an ostensibly straightforward triad over a non-harmonic pedal tone, which in many cases is a semitone away from one of the notes of that triad. This is referred to by Philip Norman as the root substitution technique. A good example of this is found in the opening of A Song of Islands. So we start off with an F-sharp minor triad, which becomes superimposed over a pedal D. That's followed by a C-sharp minor triad over the same D pedal, returning to the F-sharp minor triad, and then we get a G major triad with a C-sharp in the melody line. And I think I've got some audio of that. Lilburn's preferred vertical structures in his modal compositions then have become recontextualized in a chromatically saturated symmetrical setting. And this, I think, is evidence of an attempted synthesis in the dialectic between the conservative and the progressive elements of Lilburn's language, and also between the mimetic and the symbolic realms of musical language as well. The second of the 9 short pieces continues in the same harmonic vein, although more rhythmically articulated and lively. The piece opens with set class 414, which is constructed again from an E-flat minor chord plus 1 semitone, this time the F natural. So there's the T+1. If we add the C in, we actually have what I call a Dom 7 plus 1, so that makes a pentachord, which is the dominant 7th chord plus 1 note, a semitone away, which you can see is a fairly obvious development of that idea. The consequent introduces a phrasal response once again in set class 414, but now transposed onto D flat, and this is responded to by an exact chromatic inversion of the opening material starting on an A, which is the tritone away from the E flat. This use of exact chromatic inversion foreshadows the appearance of strict inversional symmetry in some of the later pieces in the collection. The third of the 9 short pieces, for example, for instance, features a sequential passage of 526 pentachords, those are the dominant 7th plus 1, and the last bar of this piece cadence onto a clear T+1 tetrachord. So here are the Dom 7 plus 1, and the final notes, a C natural with a B major chord underneath it. The fourth of the 9 short pieces opens with a 12-tone row of sorts. But the construction of this row derives from set classes that conform to the T+1 and Dom 7 plus 1 constraints. So the first 5 notes of the tone row are set class 5Z38, which is one of the dominant 7th plus 1 pentachords. There's an embedded F-sharp 7 chord in there plus an F natural. And notes 2 to 5 make up set class 418, one of the T+1 tetrachords. So there's the Dom 7 plus 1, and there's the T+1 inside there. The last 4 notes are also another T+1 tetrachord. Notes 2 to 5, in fact, are emphasized in the second bar, where Lilburn drops the opening F-sharp and expressly articulates that T+1 tetrachord, which is there. In the second system, a curious, almost bitonal passage occurs. In the left hand are pitch classes F, C, A flat, and D flat, together forming set class 420, another one of the T+1 tetrachords. And in the right hand are pitch classes F sharp, B flat, and E, the odd-numbered pitch classes from the opening tone row. These pitch classes, together with G, A, and D flat that complete the phrase, derive from the octatonic scale centered on C, or oct 01. The oct collection, together with the hex collection, form the primary scalar resources of the 9 short pieces. The 9th of the 9 short pieces, for example, features a melodic line strongly centered around oct 01. Throughout the piece, the right-hand material shifts between the 3 possible transpositions of the octatonic collection, while the accompaniment emphasizes quartal harmonies. The left-hand chord of stacked fourths in the opening bar combines with the sustained A in the right hand to form set class 414, another of the T+1 tetrachords. This shows how Lilburn's sonic preferences underlie even seemingly atypical harmonic choices as a quartal chord. 2 of the 9 short pieces display the axiomatic use of inversional symmetry, surely indebted to Bartók's use of such mirror image techniques in the 14 Bagatelles, Opus 6, and the last 3 books of Mikrokosmos. As opposed to the transpositional symmetries of the oct, hex, and WT collections of octatonic, hexatonic, whole tone, the use of inversional symmetry creates a contrapuntal line that operates in strict contrary motion to the primary melodic line. Examples of this feature heavily in the 7th and 8th of the short pieces. In the 8th, for instance, the entire work, including the triadic harmonies, are mirrored between the left and right hands via a double inversional axis on B flat and C. Now, when inverting an octatonic scale around a double inversional axis, only the specific oct transposition that includes these 2 pitch classes will invert onto itself, while the remaining 2 transpositions will reflect onto the other. So in the case of the axis BC, this means that only the oct 02, that's the octatonic scale with a C and D, will reflect onto itself. But the opening 7 bars of this piece are written in the oct 1-2 collection in the right hand, which means that it reflects or inverts into the left hand written in oct 01. This creates a tantalizingly non-modal accompaniment to a simple octatonic melodic line, a line that features a pentatonic subset redolent of the 2-3, so major second, minor third, sings Harry motif D-E-G. And in fact, these are the exact same pitch classes that open Lilburn's Third Symphony. Later, the 2-part texture gives way to full triadic harmony, and we can see that when inversional symmetry is applied to these triads, interesting aggregates result. A major triad above the axis of symmetry will reflect to a minor triad below. In addition, if you superimpose any major or minor triad with another major or minor triad whose root is a multiple of 4 semitones away, you end up with an aggregate that is some subset of the hexatonic collection. And in some cases, not just a subset, but in fact the entire hexatonic collection can be formed. In this work, these combine in the following way. Any triad whose root lies on the whole tone scale on C will be reflected to a triad whose root will be a multiple of 4 semitones away, so you'll get some aggregate of the hexatonic collection. Now, Lilburn uses this as a strategy for where he places his triads. A good example of this is the climax of the work. If you have a look at the 3 chords just before the climax there, the roots of those, the C sharp, E flat, and F, are all on the WT1 collection. And then just at the climax, he shifts by semitone to an F sharp chord whose root is on the WT0 collection. And at that point, you get a full aggregate of the hexatonic collection at the climax of the work. In the 7th short piece, Lilburn chooses a double inversional axis between C and C sharp. The oct 01 collection in the top staff includes the pitch classes of that inversional axis, so it inverts onto itself in the left hand. So those 2 systems are in the same octatonic collection, so there's no kind of modal antagonism. However, Lilburn does choose to partition those two Oct01 strata with a middle register line in Oct12. So he does actually put some antagonism in there. The widely spaced registral spread of this piece, allied with free rhythm and multiple laissez-vivre markings, which presumably implies that the piece is awash with pedal, creates a spacious distribution of distinct sonic strata. To summarise, these analyses of the harmonic organisation of these late piano works show that Lilburn was clearly influenced by early to mid-20th century post-tonal developments from abroad. Despite the typically chromatic language, however symbolic of a progressive impulse, Lilburn imbues them with his own triadically derived preferences, a strategy potentially stemming from the root substitution sonorities of his modal works in the 1940s. We might speculate that given the brevity and relative simplicity of the material, Lilburn felt ambivalent about the musical worth of these late instrumental works. This may stem either from the problem of trying to build long-term functional structure with symmetrical pitch resources, or it may stem from Lilburn sensing that the dialectical synthesis he was attempting was essentially an artistic compromise rather than a compelling musical direction. It's also worth noting that Jenny MacLeod was poised to embark on her most fertile project of the compositional career, the tone clock pieces, based on a rigorous expansion of pitch class set theory, bringing in symmetrical concepts that, in my opinion, far outweighed Lilburn's own dabblings in these works. In any case, the fact that these works are the last real development of Lilburn's instrumental language is a shame. Despite his orchestrational brilliance in late works such as The Birthday Offering, he could never quite bring himself to adopt the kind of spatial, textural and timbral focus that post-war European composers such as Penderecki, Nono, Ligeti, Harvey, Grise, Murai, Sciorino or Sariaho adopted. One wonders what he might have thought of the rough-hewn intricacies of Helmut Lachenmann's Musik konkret instrumental, a purely acoustic attempt to capture the timbral play of electroacoustic music. I suspect he would have hated it. For the use of extended instrumental technique seems to have been a bridge too far for Lilburn. Probably not so much from a lack of experience in New Zealand performers in the 1960s, though that was undoubtedly an issue, but to his lack of conviction at the merits of timbral manipulation as a valid musical pursuit in the instrumental domain, despite the fact he was doing precisely that with his voltage-controlled oscillators in the studio. Again, the symbolic encoding of music notation provided a barrier to Lilburn. I can't help but privately imagine what the composer of such brilliantly sonorous works as A Birthday Offering and Soundscape with Lake and River might have created had he sought to bring the glistening, crystalline space as hinted at in the 9 short pieces to the orchestral medium. Thank you.